Is anybody curious about that?
Yes.
Yes, you are? Have you all heard a nasty rumor that we actually shot at third-class passengers or locked gates to purposely keep them down? Poppycock! There were gates between the classes, and those were quarantine gates, and those were required by U.S. law. The United States required that, you see, because this was an immigration ship. And if you were an immigrant, most likely you were coming from very poor conditions. You couldn't afford very good food, so you didn't have very good nutrition, and you couldn't afford health care. So it's quite possible you could be carrying smallpox, or tuberculosis, or other contagious diseases. Now, we did inspect you before you came on board the ship, but sometimes you could be carrying a disease and we wouldn't know it. So when you got to New York City, has anybody ever heard of Ellis Island before? You actually had to go through Ellis Island if you were an immigrant. And so U.S. law required that you keep the immigrants separated on immigration ships. So the gates kept you from going over into other parts of the ship so you wouldn't contaminate other passengers, but you could always go up. As a matter of fact, the third-class passengers on Titanic had accommodations that are as good as or better than first class, or better than second class in most ships. So you see all of this area back here? That was all for third-class passengers, and they can get up to this deck called the poop deck anytime they wanted to. Do you know what they call it, the poop deck? It comes from the Latin word pupus, meaning the highest part of the ship. You thought I was going to say something else. Now, the third-class passengers also have the use of this deck right up here, and again, they can get up there anytime they want. Now, as a matter of fact, when we knew the ship was going to sink, we sent some of the crew members down there, the third-class stewards and so on, to open up as many of those gates as we possibly could. The main reason that so many of the third-class passengers were lost is simply this. Where were most of the third-class accommodations? In the lower parts of the ship, generally. And so it took them a little bit longer to get up there, and on top of that, most of them couldn't speak or read English. So here it is, the middle of the night. Somebody comes knocking on your door, yelling at you in a language you don't understand, telling you to put your life jacket on. By the time you finally decide to open the door and figure out what's going on, you're trying to find your husband, you see. You're trying to find your wife and children. But in Titanic in third class, the men were separated from the women and children. And what were we trying to do? Keep the women and children apart from the men, because it was women and children first. So you can see it was very confusing all around. But we did everything we could to try to get them up there. As a matter of fact, more third-class passengers were saved than second-class passengers. You didn't know that.
Why is that?
Well, because think about the first and second-class passengers, the men were very gallant indeed, and they all stepped aside. So they purposely did not go into the lifeboats.
What about the story about that Lord Ismay that got on, saved himself?
Mr. Ismay was actually helping in the very beginning of the sinking by loading the boats. But of course he wasn't a sailor, so he's just getting in the way. So the junior officer at the time yelled at him to get out of the way, so he kind of stuck away a little bit, then he went over to some other lifeboats and tried to help as best he could. He really wanted to assist. Now in the final part of the sinking, as the ship was actually going down like this, you see, Lord Ismay, I believe, was on this side of the ship. And as the ship was starting to go under, the very last lifeboat was being loaded, he's standing there. There's room for several more people in the boat. He's looking to try to find some people to get in. Everybody else had gone up to this part of the ship. There's nobody else standing around. There's a lifeboat going there. There's room in it. What did he do? He stepped inside. And who are we to judge unless we're in that situation ourselves? Now, of course, it haunted him the rest of his life. He lived the rest of his life to his conclusion in a very sad manner. Any other questions?
Can you talk about Mr. and Mrs. Strauss?
Mr. and Mrs. Strauss are very fine people. You know, it's a pity what happened to them, because I did have a chance to talk to them quite extensively. As I said, Mr. Strauss was the owner of Macy's department store, you know, the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. And the very end of the sinking, it was women and children first, you see. Women and children only on my side of the ship. And actually, it was my side of the ship they came to. And I was going to make an exception for Mr. Strauss, because as you can see, he was quite an elderly gentleman at the time. But he said, you should not make any rules different for me than for any of the other men. So he stepped off back onto Titanic. Then Mrs. Strauss said, we've been together for a very long time. Where you go, I go. And she stepped out of the lifeboat to be with her husband to the very end. And the last anybody saw of them, they were sitting in deck chairs together, holding hands, looking out into the ocean. Any other questions you might have? It's a memorial to them to this day in England. And actually, the motto, Lux Vestra, let your light shine. Good night, ladies.